She pushed through the VIP ward doors at 0547, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people forget to watch her. The fluorescent lights hummed above antiseptic scrubbed hallways like fluorescent insects, and Danielle Ross, Captain Danielle Ross, though no one at Seattle General knew that part, didn't flinch at the sound. She'd heard worse. Mortars sounded nothing like fluorescent tubes, but both taught you to move without announcing yourself. Her scrubs were from Target. Her sneakers had a small hole near the left toe that she'd stopped bothering to hide 3 months ago. Her name badge had a photo from 8 years prior, taken during a time when she still smiled for cameras. The laminate was cracking at the corners. The folded flag was in her locker, tucked behind her spare shoes. 13 stars visible through the worn fabric. A name stitched into the corner that she never said aloud anymore. Captain Marcus Webb, 332nd Medical Squadron, Tikrit, 2011. Dead on a Tuesday. Dead because someone had to stay behind while the rest extracted. Dead because that was the job. She began morning rounds on the VIP wing at Seattle General, moving between rooms with practiced efficiency. Room 4201, post-op hysterectomy, vital stable. For infiltrating, she'd replace that within the hour. Room 4203, orthopedic patient, pain-controlled, discharge papers ready for signature. Room 4205, empty, waiting for the afternoon admit. And then room 4207, where the machines hummed in a different frequency entirely. Colonel James Harker lay in the bed with the kind of stillness that came from knowing how to survive. His chart said Tikrit. His chart said combat injuries, classified briefing required, specialized billing codes that funneled through Medicare in ways that made Danielle's skin go cold the moment she saw them. The notes were sparse. Dr. Pierce had written them personally, which meant Pierce was being careful. Careful doctors were dangerous doctors. She recognized Harker the moment she saw him. Not his face, she'd never met him in person, but the shape of his hands, the precise angle of his shoulders, the way he didn't move when she entered the room. That was military. That was someone who'd learned that the predators notice movement. "Good morning, Colonel." Her voice came out soft. Deferential. Exactly what Seattle General expected from Danielle Ross, the nurse who ate dollar menu sandwiches at her locker and never made eye contact with the physicians. "I'm going to check your foresight and draw morning labs. My name is Danielle if you need anything." He studied her for exactly 2 seconds. "You military?" She traced the scar on her left forearm while pulling on gloves, the one that ran parallel to the brachial artery, the one that came from a pressure dressing that had gone wrong during extraction in the Sanjin Valley. Her hands didn't shake. Her hands never shook anymore. "No, sir," she said. "I'm just a nurse." The lie sat between them like a physical object. Harker was smart enough not to push it. Instead, he watched her work, the steady hand threading the 4-needle, the efficient swab of alcohol, the smooth withdrawal of blood into sterile tubes labeled with his name and medical record number. She'd done this 8,000 times. Maybe 9,000. The number didn't matter when you were good at it. When she finished, she placed her hand on his shoulder for exactly 1 second. Long enough to convey something. Not long enough to draw attention. "Your labs will be back in 40 minutes. Dr. Pierce will be in for rounds at 0800. The mention of Pierce made something shift in Harker's expression. Subtle. Almost invisible. But visible enough. She left the room and moved to the medication cart, beginning the process of documenting her work on the computer system that Dr. Pierce controlled. That was when she saw him. Expensive shoes clicking on linoleum like a metronome counting down to something. Italian leather. The kind that cost more than Danielle made in a week. Dr. Gregory Pierce, chief of surgery, moved through the VIP ward at 0603 with a tablet in one hand and an expression of calculated precision on his face. He was tall. The kind of tall that made people instinctively step aside. His suit probably cost more than Danielle's car. His haircut was fresh, she could smell the salon on him, something expensive and aggressive, like cologne designed to announce arrival. His watch was a Rolex. His pen was worn blank. Everything about Dr. Gregory Pierce announced that he was the kind of person who mattered. He didn't look at Danielle. Instead, he paused outside room 4207, the door partially open, and Danielle watched him observe Colonel Harker with the clinical precision of a man calculating an equation. His jaw tightened slightly. His fingers moved across his tablet with practiced speed, and she caught a glimpse of the screen before he angled it away from her line of sight. Billing codes. Lots of them. The kind with extra Medicare flags that added up to numbers in the six figures. Pierce moved closer to Danielle's workstation, still not acknowledging her presence directly. Instead, he picked up the stack of patient charts she'd been updating, and his eyes moved across her documentation with the expression of someone reviewing the work of someone he'd already decided was incompetent. "This entry," he said, his voice a cool blade, "is inadequately documented. Medicare requires specificity here. See?" He didn't hand her the chart. He simply held it up, ensuring the medical residents passing through the hallway could see that he was correcting someone's work. Someone who'd made a mistake. Someone who wasn't good enough. "Next time, be more precise." "Yes, doctor." Her voice remained soft. Apologetic. Exactly what he expected. He placed the chart back down on her desk with the kind of precision that made it clear this was a performance. The residents watched. The other nurses watched. The message was transmitted: Dr. Pierce was the expert. Danielle Ross was not. He left without another word, his shoes clicking away toward the elevator. Danielle looked down at the chart. Her documentation was, in fact, meticulous. Every detail. Every fluid output. Every medication. Every observation. She documented Colonel Harker's care with a kind of precision that came from 8 years of field medicine under mortar fire, from keeping detailed records when a single error meant someone didn't make it home. But precision didn't matter when Pierce was sending a different message. She finished her morning rounds, moving between rooms with a kind of invisible efficiency that made her forgettable. That was the skill they never taught in nursing school: how to be present without being noticed. How to do the work that kept people alive while other people got credit for it. At 0800, Dr. Pierce arrived for formal rounds, and Danielle stood silently while he examined Colonel Harker. Pierce's bedside manner was excellent. That was the thing about men like Pierce, they understood performance. He smiled. He asked thoughtful questions. He made Harker feel heard and cared for in a way that was obviously calculated and completely effective. "How are we feeling today, Colonel?" His voice had changed completely. Warm. Professional. Genuinely concerned in a way that Danielle knew was absolutely practiced. "Any pain? We're not managing well." "Shoulders tight," Harker said. "Otherwise stable." "Excellent." Pierce made notes on his tablet, and Danielle caught the flash of billing codes again. More flags. More supplemental payment codes. More fraud, if she was reading it correctly. And she was reading it correctly. She'd spent 18 months watching billing patterns at Seattle General, learning the systems, learning how Dr. Pierce moved money through Medicare codes that added up to approximately $847,000 in unauthorized payments over the past 2 years alone. That was why she was here. That was why Air Force Intelligence had assigned her to Seattle General under a civilian contract, why they'd given her a nursing degree to support her cover, why she'd been eating dollar menu sandwiches and accepting humiliation from the exact kind of man she'd been trained to observe. Colonel Harker was recovering from classified briefings. The Department of Defense needed to ensure his debriefing wasn't compromised. And they needed to know if Dr. Pierce was using his access to VIP patients for anything beyond Medicare fraud. She'd expected the fraud. She hadn't expected to recognize her former replacement in the hospital bed. Pierce finished his examination and left, and Danielle returned to room 4207 to adjust Harker's for drip. The pain medication was running low. "How long?" Harker asked quietly. She didn't pretend to misunderstand him. "How long what, sir? How long have you been watching me?" Her hands continued their work without hesitation. Steady hands. Medic hands. Since the moment you arrived at this hospital, Colonel. You're safe here. You're safe as long as I'm the one caring for you. He nodded slowly, understanding what that promise meant. Tikrit. Different tour. The truth, technically. She didn't elaborate. Your care is my priority. Everything else is handled. What he didn't know, what Pierce didn't know, was that the FBI had been investigating Dr. Gregory Pierce for 6 months. What Harker didn't know was that Danielle Ross had spent 2 years in combat medicine in the Helmand province before joining JSOC's Medical Support Division. What Pierce absolutely didn't know was that there was currently a federal investigation into his billing practices, and that investigation had been cleared through the highest levels of military command. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in exactly 2 days, everything would change. A psychiatric patient would escape from the locked unit. A scalpel would find its way into his hands. And Captain Danielle Ross would make a choice that would expose every secret she'd been keeping, the one she could control, and the one she couldn't. For now, she simply adjusted the 4, documented her work with meticulous precision, and moved forward with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her invisible to everyone except the one person who mattered. The one person who, by the end of this week, would know exactly who she was. The grand rounds began like all the others, Dr. Pierce entering Colonel Harker's room at 0800 hours with 12 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Danielle had already reviewed the morning labs, adjusted the 4-drip, documented the vitals in the precise military medical format that Pierce dismissed as civilian theater. She stood at the far side of the bed, making herself smaller than she was, which required a skill she'd perfected over 3 tours of doing exactly the opposite. Pierce's voice cut through the room like a scalpel finding resistance. Gentlemen, this is an instructional moment. He held up Danielle's chart, the one she'd filled out at 2,300 hours the previous night with the kind of meticulous detail that would have satisfied a 3-star general, and waved it like a piece of contaminated gauze. This is what inadequate documentation looks like. Nurse, what's your name again? Ross? This wouldn't pass muster at a veterinary clinic. The resident smiled. Small smiles, the kind they'd learned from watching how predators establish hierarchy. Danielle felt the weight of those eyes the way she'd felt RPG fire before the explosion, not in her body, but in the space immediately before impact. She took one measured breath. Just one. She'd been trained to take 14 before returning fire. One breath was restraint so complete it was a form of violence. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from pain. Not from humiliation. From the precise mixture of rage and discipline that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Pierce, the movement as controlled as clearing a weapon after a firefight. Colonel Harker's care requires specialized combat injury protocols, Doctor. Her voice had dropped half an octave. The residents probably didn't notice. Pierce did. His jaw tightened like a man who'd just realized the mouse wasn't a mouse. I documented according to military medical standards. Everything in these charts is accurate. Pierce's face went cold. Not anger cold. Calculation cold. The face of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. You're a civilian nurse, Ms. Ross. What would you possibly know about military anything? She didn't answer. The answer was already in the room, hanging in the air like ozone after a defibrillator discharge. Instead, she turned to Colonel Harker, checked his pulse point with 2 fingers, strong, steady, the rhythm of a man whose heart had learned to beat under fire, and made a note on the flow sheet. The residents filed out behind Pierce like they'd been siphoned from the room. The vending machine would have been merciful compared to what happened next, but mercy wasn't part of Dr. Pierce's clinical philosophy. 3 days passed without incident, which meant 3 days of Pierce setting traps with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Danielle moved through the hospital corridors at 0600, pushing a supply cart, restocking the nursing station, existing in the background with the kind of invisibility that came from knowing how to disappear in plain sight. She had 17 years of experience being in rooms where people forgot she was present. 17 years of listening to doctors talk about things they thought nurses didn't understand. The vending machine sat in the break room like a confession booth. Danielle had fed it $47 over the past 6 weeks, dollar menu lunches that sustained her body while her mind reviewed classified briefings on her burner phone during 15-minute breaks. She was unwrapping a turkey sandwich when Pierce appeared in the doorway with the precision of a hunter who'd read the prey's habits. "Still slumming it, bargain bin." His voice was casual in the way predators sound casual before they strike. He leaned against the refrigerator with the posture of a man who owned the space. "Hospital cafeteria too expensive on your salary." Danielle set her sandwich down with deliberate care. Each movement exact. Each breath measured. She'd been taught that showing emotion was a tactical liability. Showing nothing was a form of armor. "Or are you just too incompetent to budget properly?" Pierce smiled. The smile wasn't warmth. It was the bare showing of teeth, the visual equivalent of a threat made manifest. "Maybe I should have security escort you out for loitering in unauthorized areas. You spend an awful lot of time around the VIP ward, don't you? Almost like you're trying to do a doctor's job." "I'm on my assigned break, doctor." Each word crystalline. Each word a small blade. "Is there a clinical matter you need to discuss?" He laughed, not with humor, but with the sound of a man confirming something he already knew. He left, and Danielle sat alone in the break room with her sandwich and her discipline, and the small terrible knowledge that this was escalating in precisely the way she'd been trained to recognize. 2 days later, at the nursing station around 1845 hours, Pierce found her reviewing the day's charting. The billing codes were visible on her screen if someone knew what they were looking at. Danielle had been reviewing them methodically, not with the casual curiosity of a nurse, but with the specific attention of someone conducting a federal investigation. Pierce had no idea that the reason she hadn't raised alarms about his supplemental Medicare submissions was because the Department of Defense had explicitly instructed her not to. Not yet. Not until they had all the layers. "You're spending an awful lot of time with the VIP patients," Pierce said, settling into the chair across from her with the comfortable posture of institutional power. "Someone might think you're trying to do a doctor's job, Ms. Ross. And frankly..." He tapped her charts with one finger, the gesture dismissive, territorial. "Someone this incompetent shouldn't be handling critical patients at all. You're going to hurt someone." The hospital around them continued its nighttime rhythm, the distant sound of footsteps on tile, the mechanical wheeze of a ventilator from a nearby room, the low electronic hum of monitors tracking vital signs in the darkness. Danielle looked directly at him, and her voice dropped to the absolute calm of someone who had practiced restraint so long it had become a weapon in itself. "Colonel Harker was my replacement in the 332nd Medical Squadron." Each word landed like a round in a magazine. Controlled. Precise. Devastating. "I know exactly what his care requires. Better than anyone in this hospital. Better than anyone in this state." Pierce's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. His pupils dilated slightly. His breathing pattern changed. The small micro-expressions that interrogators were trained to catch, the ones that revealed when the target had said something they couldn't unsay. He stood up slowly, and his hand went to his pocket, not for a weapon, but for something that felt like it to Danielle. His phone. He walked away without another word, already scrolling, already making calculations that would lead him toward decisions that would destroy his own freedom in increments he couldn't yet see. Danielle returned to her charting, her hand steady, her heart rate unchanged. She'd already known he would escalate. She'd been trained to recognize the moment when prey became hunter, and hunter became cornered animal. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, at 2,100 hours, alarms erupted from the psychiatric wing like a scream suddenly finding a voice. Code missing patient. Class A alert. Danielle was finishing her documentation on the evening meds when the announcement cut through the hospital's careful quiet. She moved before conscious thought, muscle memory pulling her toward Colonel Harker's room. The VIP ward was 3 corridors away, but she covered the distance like she'd covered distances under fire, economical, fast, lethal in her efficiency. The sound hit her first. Breaking glass. The small terrible sound of chaos entering controlled space. She pushed through the door to Colonel Harker's room and found exactly what she'd been trained to recognize, a psychiatric patient in acute decompensation, unfocused eyes, the tremor of someone caught between reality and psychosis. A surgical scalpel in his hand. Silver. Sterile. Surgical-grade steel with a handle designed for precision, now being wielded by someone who'd lost all capacity for it. "They're listening," the patient whispered, advancing on Harker's bed. "They're all listening." Voices in the walls. Listening. Danielle didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a choice she'd learned not to make. She stepped directly between them, between the blade and the colonel, between the chaos and the man she'd been assigned to protect. Her hands rose in the non-threatening posture she'd taught to younger medics, palms open, shoulders low, voice dropping to the register that soldiers recognized as command. "I'm here to help. Let's put that down together." Nice and slow. The patient lunged with the scalpel like it was an extension of his psychosis, and Danielle redirected with the wrist lock she'd learned in combat training at Fort Sam Houston, a technique that had saved her in Tikrit and would save her now. Her grip was firm but not crushing. Her eye stayed on his eyes. But the blade caught her shoulder on the follow-through, deep and hot, tearing through scrub fabric and finding flesh with the kind of precision that turned every nerve ending into an antenna broadcasting pure signal. Pain exploded white and terrible. Her blood was warm against her skin, iron and salt and the visceral reality of being wounded. The patient recovered faster than she'd anticipated, swinging the scalpel again with the unpredictable violence of decompensated psychosis. The second stab drove deep into her left side, between her ribs, and the world narrowed to that single point of impact. Breathing became optional. Everything became secondary to the fact of the blade. She completed the disarm anyway. Her left hand, shaking, bleeding, running on muscle memory from a dozen field thoracotomies and 100 scenarios worse than this, came up and trapped his wrist. The scalpel clattered to the tile floor with a small terrible sound of surrender. She hit the code button with her elbow and turned back to Colonel Harker, whose fur had torn loose in the struggle, his line disconnected, his access point bleeding. Danielle's hands moved. Pain was information. Pain was data to be processed and filed and acted upon. She compressed her own wounds with her right hand, blood flowing between her fingers, and with her left she stabilized Harker's foresight, her fingers finding the correct position through tactile memory alone. She barked orders to the residents flooding through the door. 14-gauge angiocath in my left antecubital fossa. Pressure here. Saline wide open. Restrain his left arm. Someone get me hemostatic gauze now. Her voice never wavered. The voice of someone who had commanded respect in more dire circumstances. In the moment before the room tilted and the floor rose up to meet her, she saw Colonel Harker's eyes open, recognition dawning, and she knew that the game had changed. Everything was different now. Everything was worse. The darkness came soft and absolute, like landing in a place where protocols meant nothing and secrets became visible. The monitors came first. 2 short bursts, then a wailing crescendo that turned every head on the 6th floor toward the psychiatric ward. 2,100 hours. Danielle's eyes snapped open in the darkness of her recovery room, muscles moving before consciousness caught up, a habit forged in Tikrit where alarms meant incoming and waiting meant death. Her shoulder screamed. The surgical tape across her ribs pulled tight as she swung her legs over the bed rail, for tubing taut against the back of her hand. The night nurse had stepped out for a bathroom break 3 minutes ago. Danielle knew because she'd been counting. Waiting. The way soldiers wait when the world is too quiet. Code overhead. Not a medical code. Something worse. The intercom crackled with words that made orderlies move fast, made security reach for their radios. A patient missing from locked psych. Missing for 18 minutes. Missing with access to the supply carts, and supply carts held sharps. Danielle was moving down the hallway before the announcement finished, her bare feet soundless on cold tile, her movements liquid despite the white-hot lancing through her left side. The pain was information. Pain was data. Process it and move. She'd moved through far worse in a medic tent in Anbar province with shrapnel in her ribs and no anesthesia, just adrenaline and mission. Colonel Harker's room was 6 doors down. She knew because she'd walked this corridor 437 times in the last 72 hours, measuring distances, memorizing layouts, doing what Air Force intelligence had trained her to do, know every exit, every camera, every possible threat vector. She found him 3 steps inside the door. The psychiatric patient, a man named Patterson, 63 years old, diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia with acute decompensation, documented violent episodes, stood over Harker's bed with a scalpel blade that caught the fluorescent light like a mirror. The blade trembled. Patterson's hand trembled. His breathing came in sharp, panic bursts. Harker lay half-sedated in the hospital bed, morphine keeping him from full awareness, keeping him from understanding that the man standing over him was about to cut. "Don't," Danielle said. One word. "Flat." The voice of someone who had commanded troops under fire. Patterson spun. The blade came up. His eyes were the eyes of a trapped animal, dilated, unfocused, running on pure fear and broken chemistry. He didn't see a nurse. He saw whatever his fractured mind had convinced him was standing in his way. He lunged. Danielle didn't sidestep. Didn't dodge. She moved directly into the attack, her body sliding between the blade and Harker's chest in the same movement she'd learned in combat medicine training. You don't get cut on accident, you get cut on purpose, and purpose means you're still thinking about the outcome. Patterson was running on instinct. That made him predictable. The blade went in at an angle below her collarbone, deep and burning, a sensation like being struck by lightning that traveled down her entire left side. She felt the resistance of tissue, the metallic scrape of steel on bone. She didn't make a sound. Her left hand came up and caught Patterson's wrist, not to pull the knife out, but to control it, to understand its trajectory through her own body as information. Muscle memory took over. Her right hand clamped down on his elbow joint from the underside, creating a lever point that would only allow one of 3 outcomes: release the blade, break the arm, or both. She applied pressure with the calculated precision of someone who had trained this move 5,000 times on gelatin simulators and practice dummies. Patterson screamed. The blade fell. His wrist made a wet snapping sound that echoed in the small room. The scalpel clattered against linoleum. Patterson dropped to his knees, cradling his wrist, and Danielle felt the warmth blooming across her left shoulder and down her ribs. Blood. Her blood. Arterial spray was bright red and pulsed with rhythm. Venous bleeding was darker and flowed. This was somewhere between, which meant accuracy was everything. Harker's fur line had torn loose in the struggle. The tubing lay across the bedsheet, leaking fluid at a steady drip that would empty the line in less than 90 seconds. Danielle pressed her right hand hard against her own shoulder wound, using the heel of her palm to compress the artery against bone. Her left side screamed. She walked 3 steps to the 4-pole, her vision narrowing slightly, blood loss at this rate, maybe 4 minutes until cardiac arrest, and reached for the bag with one hand while maintaining pressure on her wound with the other. "Someone find me a 500 milliliter bolus. Normal saline. Now," she said. Not a request. Not a question. Her voice had dropped an octave, carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A nurse appeared in the doorway, face pale. "Oh my God, you're..." 18-gauge angiocath in the left antecubital. Cardiac monitor on Harker. And get me 4x4 gauze and surgical tape. Move. She was holding pressure on her own shoulder wound with one hand while reaching for Harker's arm with the other, her fingers finding the vein with the certainty of someone who had done this 400 times. The nurse stood frozen. Danielle looked at her with eyes like tempered steel. "Did I stutter, Lieutenant?" The nurse didn't move because she was a lieutenant. She moved because she was standing in front of something that had stopped looking like a floor nurse 2 minutes ago. She moved because the voice had the weight of command. The needle went in smooth. Flash of dark red blood in the chamber. Danielle advanced the catheter with her thumb and secured the line with tape that she stripped one-handed from her pocket, a habit from field medicine. Always carry your own supplies, never depend on supply chains when tourniquets are running out. The 4 bolus came through her fingers and she ran it wide open, watching the drip chamber accelerate from 30 drops per minute to 60, the fluid pressure climbing. Her own wound was still bleeding. She could feel it, a steady warmth seeping across her ribs that meant the blade had caught more than just muscle. She watched Harker's monitor, the green line climbing steadily, oxygen saturation at 76% now, climbing toward 80. His heart rate was 94. Stable. The fluid was getting to him, circulating, buying his body time to compensate. Get security to restrain Patterson in Psych Hold Room 3, she said. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing that showing fear means the people around you fall apart. Orthopedics consult on his left wrist. And someone call Dr. Pierce and tell him we have a code blue situation developing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment the nurse looked at Danielle's left shoulder and said, "We need to get you to trauma." Danielle shook her head. In 60 seconds. First I need to make sure my patient is stable. The room fell silent except for the monitor beeping its steady rhythm and Harker's sedated breathing, and in that silence Danielle felt something shift. The way people looked at her had changed. The way she'd given orders had changed. The mask was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Captain. Not nurse. Captain. She turned toward the door to walk herself to trauma, and that's when she saw Pierce standing in the hallway, tablet in his hands, documentation already open, incident reports already filed. His eyes moved from her face to her shoulder to the blood dripping slowly down her ribs, and she watched him calculate. He'd come to fire her. He'd prepared the paperwork. And now she was standing in front of him, having just saved 2 lives with the kind of precision that no floor nurse ever possessed. Pierce's jaw tightened. His fingers moved across the tablet, but his expression had frozen into something that looked like a man watching his entire world reorganize itself in real time. Danielle took one measured breath. She walked past him toward the trauma bay, each step leaving small red droplets on the tile, each step a heartbeat closer to the moment when everything she'd hidden became impossible to hide. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were watching. The elevator doors closed behind her, and she was alone with the knowledge that in exactly 17 minutes, when the surgical team stitched her up and asked her what happened, she would have to decide whether to disappear or stay and face what was coming. She pressed her hand harder against her shoulder. The pain was information. And the information said her mission was about to end. The recovery room was all white tile and the smell of antiseptic, a smell that usually meant safety but now meant something else. Something final. Danielle's shoulder was wrapped so tight her breathing came shallow. 2 stitches. 34 total. The stab to her side had missed the kidney by 3 centimeters. The attending surgeon had said that 3 times, like it mattered. Like survival was supposed to feel like relief instead of this, a weight pressing down on her chest that had nothing to do with the bandages. She lay there at 6:27 a.m., watching me 4 drip. 1 drop every 3 seconds. Count them. Don't think about Sarah. Don't think about the mission. Count the drops. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Pierce walked in wearing his concern like a costume that didn't fit. He pulled a chair close to her bed, close enough that she could see the faint coffee stain on his cuff, the watch that cost more than her monthly salary. His jaw moved in something that might have been sympathy if she hadn't heard him laugh 2 days ago. Captain, he stopped himself. Corrected. Danielle. How are you feeling? She didn't move. Alive. Yes. Remarkable, actually. The psychiatric evaluations are still ongoing for the patient who attacked you. Completely unpredictable behavior. You couldn't have known. He leaned back. The chair creaked. Although, and I hate to say this given your obvious injuries, there are some concerns we need to discuss. Her eye stayed on me for. The incident report, he continued, documents that you initiated physical contact with a patient in crisis. Now, I know you were trying to help, but Joint Commission regulations strictly prohibit unauthorized physical intervention. There's language in Section 4.2.3 about nursing staff exceeding their scope of practice. He placed his hand on the bed rail. His fingernails were manicured. We have a duty to follow protocol. Even when people think they're being heroes. The word hit exactly where it was supposed to. She felt it lodge in her ribs, right beside the bandages. You understand, he said, voice dropping to that practiced confidentiality tone, that this has to be documented. For the hospital's protection. For yours, actually. If anything goes wrong, you need to be covered. She finally looked at him. Colonel Harker's stable. His foresight was compromised. Someone had to. I know, Pierce interrupted, and the false sympathy in his voice was worse than anger. That's what makes this so difficult. You did the right thing for the wrong reason. You exceeded your authority. There will need to be a review. He stood. Get some rest, Danielle. You've earned it. By 9:15 a.m., Dr. Pierce sat in his office typing an incident report that read like a legal document written in medical language. Each sentence was a brick in a wall he was building between her and this hospital. He used words like unauthorized, exceeded scope, potential safety violation. He cited regulations that most nurses had never heard of. He made sure each citation was accurate. That was the genius of it, it was all technically true, just arranged in a way that made her look dangerous. The report was forwarded to hospital administration with a subject line marked urgent. By 10:27 a.m., Pierce was leading grand rounds with the residents. He pulled up the incident report on the display screen where everyone could see it. The font was small enough that they had to lean forward to read. He walked through each point methodically, his voice the neutral tone of someone simply explaining facts. What we see here, he said, highlighting a section, is a case study in scope of practice violation. The nursing staff member, despite good intentions, made a decision that put herself and the patient at further risk. This is exactly why we have protocols. This is why we have chains of command. He looked at the residents. Has anyone worked with Captain, with the nursing staff member in question? 3 hands went up. And in your observations, did you see any indication she might take matters into her own hands? The residents exchanged glances. One spoke carefully, she was very focused on the colonel's care. Too focused, perhaps. Pierce clicked to the next slide. This is what happens when personnel believe they know better than the established system. This is what happens when someone lets emotion override judgment. He paused. Let it sink in. I want you to remember this case. This is not the behavior we reward. The silence in the room was the sound of young doctors learning that loyalty to the institution mattered more than gratitude for saving a patient's life. The documentation pile grew. By noon, Pierce had sent additional notes to the compliance officer. By 1:45 p.m., he'd flagged her file in the system with a status alert, under review, potential protocol violation. By 3:20 p.m., he'd had a conversation with the hospital's legal counsel, the kind of conversation that happened in closed offices with closed doors, and when it was over, there was a paper trail thick enough to justify removing her from the hospital entirely. She was released at 5:15 p.m. with discharge papers, pain medication, and a letter stating that her employment was suspended pending investigation. The investigation would take 14 days. The letter said she'd be contacted with the results. The letter did not say those results were already predetermined. By 6:36 p.m., Danielle stood at the bus stop 3 blocks from Seattle General. The rain came down in thick sheets that turned the streetlights fuzzy and orange. Her civilian clothes, borrowed from the hospital supply closet, hung loose on her frame. She held a cardboard box that someone had packed for her, personal items from the locker in the break room. Inside was a cracked ceramic mug with the faded logo of the 332nd Medical Squadron. Someone had given it to her 6 years ago. Inside was a succulent with brown-edged leaves that she'd kept alive on the break room windowsill for 7 months. Inside was the folded flag. The flag was approximately 4 inches by 6 inches when folded. It was made of silk. It was folded with the precision that the military taught you, 14 folds, each one perfect, so that it became a dense triangle with only the blue and stars visible. Sarah Chen's name was stitched into the corner in thread so fine you could barely see it unless you knew where to look. Sarah Chen. 26 years old. Combat medic. The kind of person who could stop hemorrhage with one hand and call in medevac with the other while singing off-key. The kind of person who died in Danielle's arms in Tikrit because an IED had taken most of her left side and there was no amount of field thoracotomy with a combat knife that could fix that. There was only holding her hand and telling her the extraction was coming even though they both knew it was a lie. The rain soaked through the box. The succulent soil darkened. Danielle's phone buzzed. Another message. A number she recognized. Captain Ross. Recall to base. Mission status unknown. Report by 2300 hours. This is not a request. She stared at the message. Recall meant extraction. Extraction meant sitting in a debriefing room at Joint Base Lewis McChord explaining how a civilian nurse had failed to protect the target. How the cover had been blown. How her presence in the hospital had become a liability instead of an asset. Extraction meant the conversation where they asked her what went wrong. Everything went wrong, she would tell them. I chose the wrong path. I let him see too much. I made a choice to save a life and that choice cost me the mission. That conversation was waiting for her on base. She powered down the phone instead. Watched the screen go black. Felt the weight of 14 years of service become 14 pounds of cardboard box getting heavier in the rain. The bus pulled up, air brakes hissing. She didn't board it. She set the box down on the metal bench of the shelter and watched water pool around the bottom. The mug would break completely if she moved. The flag would get wet. The succulent was already dying. Everything was already broken. Everything in the box was already lost. 3 blocks away, in the administrative offices of Seattle General, a routine background check system processed termination paperwork for nursing staff. The system was designed to flag any unusual security clearances, any federal employment history that contradicted the civilian personnel file. Danielle Ross's file triggered 7 different alerts simultaneously. Her social security number was tied to a classified security clearance issued by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Her employment history showed gaps that matched deployment schedules. Her next of kin notification listed a military address. The system recognized what human eyes in a hospital office couldn't see, that she was not who her scrub said she was. The alerts cascaded through federal databases. At Joint Base Lewis McChord, a watch officer noticed the flag in the system and marked it as urgent. In Seattle, at the same moment that Danielle was deciding whether to disappear into the rain or report to base, a notification reached the office of the hospital administrator. It read, "Security clearance verification required, federal employee identification flagged in personnel termination." The administrator printed it out. Read it twice. Picked up a phone. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance wouldn't arrive for another 4 hours. The convoy of black SUVs wouldn't turn onto the hospital drive for another 5. The moment when Colonel Harker would stand in the hospital lobby and speak Danielle's call sign aloud, "That's Captain Ross." Call sign Valkyrie, that moment existed in the future, unreachable from where she stood now. Right now, in the rain, she was just a woman with a box of broken things, a suspended nursing license, and a choice that had already been made for her before she even understood she was making it. The box tipped slightly on the wet bench. She caught it before it fell. Her shoulder screamed with the movement, the white-hot reminder that she was still bleeding, still healing, still just a body holding another body together while everything fell apart. She held the box. She held it together. She did what she had always done, she endured. Behind her, in the darkening city, the machine was already moving. Gears were turning. Alerts were processing. A general was being briefed. A Marine was pulling files. An FBI field office was opening an investigation into Medicare fraud that would lead directly back to Dr. Pierce and the careful documentation he'd built so carefully. But in the rain, in the cold of the Seattle evening, Danielle didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that she had failed. That Sarah was still dead. That the flag in the box was all that was left of her. The bus pulled away without her. She didn't move. The bus pulled away without her. She didn't move. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something she hadn't won yet. Danielle Ross stood at the curb with a cardboard box, a cracked mug, a dying succulent, and a folded flag. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, report to base by 0600. Details classified. She had already decided to disappear instead. To take a job in Portland. To become someone else. To stop being the woman who bled out on a hospital floor while saving a man whose name she wasn't supposed to know. But classified phone systems don't send text messages. 36 hours earlier, Seattle General's routine background check system had flagged something during her termination paperwork. The kind of something that makes junior IT specialists call their supervisors. The kind of something that puts a person in a database that doesn't officially exist. Captain Danielle Ross, U.S. Air Force Intelligence, authorized cover operation, security clearance level TS/SCI with SAP access. The hospital's Human Resources Department had no idea they were firing a federal agent. They just knew she was being terminated for unauthorized use of force and protocol violations, documentation Dr. Pierce had meticulously crafted while she lay bleeding in the ICU. But the flag changed everything. By 8:44 a.m. the next morning, Seattle General's lobby transformed. Not dramatically. Not with sirens or urgent footsteps. Instead, it was the terrible silence of precision and authority. Uniforms arrived in synchronized waves: Air Force, Marine Corps, someone's driver with a detail brief and communication headset coiled against his collar. They didn't run. Didn't announce themselves. Just filled the space like a presence that made the air pressure change, like the moment before a detonation when everyone stops breathing. A two-star general in dress blues stood near the information desk, his aide holding a leather briefcase that probably contained redacted documents with her name on them. Dr. Pierce was in the surgeon's lounge reviewing billing reports when the message came through the hospital's internal phone system. Security needed him. Now. Administrative office. No explanation required. He arrived to find the corridor outside the administrator's office lined with military personnel, faces forward, eyes front. Inside, Colonel James Harker stood in a hospital gown and bare feet, every inch of his presence shifted into something rigid and formal. His wounds were healing. His bearing was unbreakable. And behind him, flanking the administrator's desk like sentries, stood a Marine colonel in dress uniform and a two-star general whose rank insignia caught the fluorescent lights like a warning. Dr. Pierce's throat tightened. What is the meaning of? That's Captain Ross, call sign Valkyrie. Colonel Harker's voice cut across the room like a blade. Not angry. Just factual. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. You've been bullying a decorated combat veteran. A federal agent. An investigator assigned to your facility specifically because of your financial practices. The Marine colonel stepped forward, holding a service record. His reading voice was precise, each word dropped like a spent shell casing. Silver Star for Gallantry in Action, Tikrit, 2019. Bronze Star with Valor Device for Leadership Under Fire, Sanjin Valley, 2018. Purple Heart for wounds received during emergency extraction of 12 casualties under sustained fire, Tikrit Medical Compound, 2019. Captain Ross disarmed an armed attacker with a field combat technique and saved a superior officer's life at the cost of her own blood. Your hospital's incident report called it provoking an unstable patient. Pierce's face was chalk. This is a mistake. I have no. The two-star general moved forward. Not quickly. Like a tide that doesn't hurry because it knows it's inevitable. He was the kind of person who filled rooms by existing in them. His dress blues bore the insignia of someone who'd flown F-16s in the 1990s and made decisions that affected continental strategy. He looked at the administrator's desk, then at the folded flag now resting on it, the 13-star Air Force flag, the kind presented to families of the fallen, the kind that meant someone had given everything. He saluted it. A full military salute. His hand came to his brow and held. The room didn't breathe. Captain Ross was conducting a federal investigation into Medicare fraud, the general said to the room. Not to Pierce. To everyone. Her nursing position was an authorized cover operation. She was assigned to monitor this patient's care and document financial irregularities. She also prevented a murder on hospital grounds. He lowered his hand. She did her job while bleeding out on a floor. What did you do, Dr. Pierce? The FBI agents moved before Pierce could answer. They didn't hurry either. Professional. Systematic. One agent placed a folder on the desk containing billing records, spreadsheets, payment routing diagrams. 17 VIP patients over 2 years. Specialized combat injury codes that triggered enhanced Medicare reimbursements. $847,000 in fraudulent billing. And underneath it all, a second folder. An attempted forgery of federal employee records. An incident report signed by Dr. Pierce claiming Captain Ross had provoked a psychiatric patient to justify termination of a federal investigator mid-operation. Obstruction of justice, the agent said. Falsification of federal documents. Wire fraud. Attempted obstruction of a federal investigation. That's 15 to 20 years, Dr. Pierce. Or you take a plea. Through the windows, Danielle watched from the corridor where she'd been standing for the last 3 minutes, uniform blazer still in the lobby, credentials still being processed, her identity still transitioning from the woman who pushed a med cart to the woman who commanded rooms just by walking into them. The residents who'd laughed during Pierce's grand rounds were visible behind him, their mouths open, their eyes fixed on the handcuffs. Dr. Pierce folded. People like him always do, once they understand the size of the falling object. He took the plea agreement. 18 months in minimum security. Restitution. And a work release program that assigned him to exactly the kind of job he'd spent his entire career avoiding. By week 3, he was driving a medical supply van with a route that included Seattle General's loading dock. By week 6, he'd become invisible. No one noticed the man in the orange safety vest unloading boxes. No one connected the haunted eyes to the surgeon who'd once humiliated residents during grand rounds. 6 months later, Danielle stood in that hospital parking lot in her Air Force dress uniform, waiting for her final debrief before transfer to the base hospital in San Diego. The parking lot was the same. The rain was still falling. But she was no longer the woman at the bus stop with a cardboard box. She was a captain walking with the kind of bearing that comes from having already proven what you're capable of. She saw him through the loading bay window. Orange vest. Medical supply van. The same hands that had signed her termination paperwork now sorting boxes with the blank expression of someone who'd become completely unremarkable. He looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. He looked away first. Danielle felt nothing, not triumph, not satisfaction. Just the weight of understanding how small his power actually was. How temporary. How hollow. Her office at the base hospital was waiting. The flag was already mounted there, framed in a shadow box beside a photograph of her and Sarah Chen in Tikrit dust and combat fatigues, arms around each other, both of them still alive enough to smile. Colonel Harker came by for his final medical clearance before return to duty, fully recovered, cleared for flight status. He noticed the shadow box first. Sarah, he asked quietly. Sarah Chen. 332nd Medical Squadron medic. She pulled you out of that compound. Danielle signed his return to duty paperwork with a kind of precision that made the pen move like a scalpel. She died pulling out 11 others. And you. Harker's eyes held the photograph for a long moment. Then he saluted it, a formal gesture, the kind reserved for the honored dead. She saved my life twice. Once in the desert. Once today, because you avenged her. He paused at the door. That matters, Captain. That weight you're carrying, it means something. After he left, Danielle walked the base hospital corridors in uniform, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be less than she was. A young medic stopped her near the supply station, fresh from field training, still carrying that hunger to learn, still believing her hands could save the world if she just learned the right procedures. Is it true you performed an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife? Danielle thought about Pierce, about power built on titles and fear and falsified documents. She thought about Sarah, about what real strength looked like, about the ability to help when it cost everything. She met the young medic's eyes and said what she'd learned in Blood and Rain and Broken Promises. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The medic nodded, understanding something that couldn't be taught in classroom scenarios or simulation labs. Understanding that heroism was the willingness to bleed for someone else's survival. Understanding that the uniform was just the covering for something deeper. Danielle continued down the corridor, past portraits of decorated officers, her own reflection finally matching the rank on her chest. Through the window, rain fell on the base, but she was no longer running. No longer pretending. No longer invisible. The folded flag caught the light on her office wall. Sarah Chen's name. Infinite honor. The cost paid and finally recognized. And tomorrow, young medics would train for the same impossible choices she'd already made. Some of them would make different decisions. Some of them would understand, the way she understood now, that the greatest power you could ever hold wasn't in a title or a uniform, it was in the split-second decision to step between danger and the person you'd sworn to protect. That's the story you never see coming, the choice that changes everything when everyone's watching and when no one is. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are just to survive, subscribe now. The next video is about someone who paid an even higher price for her silence, and what happened when her real identity surfaced on live television. Like and comment below with your thoughts. Did Pierce get what he deserved, or should the consequences have been worse?